Hello, History 1032 class. This is Joel June again, your instructor. And I'm just here to introduce our weekly review videos. Every week we are going to be having a PowerPoint set of PowerPoint questions as well as a primary source document, although we do not have one here for the first week. And every week I'm going to be doing a review video that kind of covers and goes more in depth to those questions. Throughout the week, as you answer the questions, and just a little bit of insight on how I do the grading. Obviously, there are some basic criteria for the grading. As you saw in the instructions, each of your answers have to be at least 35 words in length. They have to completely answer all portions of the questions in order to receive credit. You have to bring in your own thoughts and your own ideas. You can't just retype what's already in the PowerPoint. Those are kind of the basic requirements. A lot of times, though, as long as you demonstrate that you have read and understand the material and are able to put it into your own words, I will be giving you credit for the answers. But typically, I won't be going in and giving you direct feedback on your responses. The only time I go in to give direct feedback is if you lose points on a question, and then I'll go in and explain why that was, what I found confusing, if your answers were not long enough. But if you did a good job, I'm just going to give you full points. And then at the end of every week during these review videos, I'm going to go ahead and go into more detail about the questions themselves, about what kind of answers I was looking for, about some of the good answers that all of you provided me with. And really that's going to be kind of how I give you my feedback on those questions. So as opposed to writing out individual answers to everyone, I'm going to kind of be giving a broad interpretation of the questions and bringing in your answers here and there and reflecting on what went well, what some of the confusion was, and so forth. And if you ever have any questions about the feedback that I gave you, about the questions, the PowerPoint questions, or the primary source discussion questions themselves, please feel free to contact me and let me know. Alright, so moving ahead here, let's just kind of go through the PowerPoint questions for this week, and this will kind of give you an idea of how these will go. I will go over the questions that I asked you and kind of give you some of the responses that were out there and my kind of take on them as well. So, PowerPoint question number 1, why do you think the Columbian Exchange is so important? And can you think of any ways that your life today is still impacted by the exchange? And kind of the first, the obvious one, the one that a lot of you brought into your answers this week was, the importance of the exchange of plants and animals, how much that impacts kind of our daily lives and our daily diets today. If you think about, kind of the vast majority of foods that we eat on a daily basis, whether you're talking about, hamburgers, if you're talking about spaghetti, if you're talking about pizza, if you think all of these things, chocolate, coffee, all these would not have been possible without the Columbian Exchange. And that the vast majority of kind of the what we conceptualize as food today was made possible by the mixing of these foods between the Eastern and the Western hemispheres. Another good aspect a lot of people brought out is that it ultimately led to an increase in global population because of the ability to take these plants that grow very well in one area, move them to another area of the globe that grows very well, which can then support larger and larger populations. You can think of potatoes being transported to Ireland, creating a population boom there. If you think about the entire kind of wheat production that we have here in the United States and how that has really been able to lead to large population levels in the United States. Wheat, of course, came from Eurasia originally, so the very fact that how much we base our current population levels on the foods that were required by this exchange is pretty amazing. And that certainly the world would look much different today if this exchange had not happened. Another big aspect and very important aspect of the exchange, of course, was the exchange of diseases. And the fact that the individual groups that were living in North and South America had not had sustained contact with livestock where a lot of these diseases originated, and therefore had built up very few immunities to them, meant that they were very susceptible to these diseases such as smallpox, influenza, measles, typhus, and so forth. And ultimately, if you take into account both the impacts of the diseases as well as the kind of rippling ramifications on the rest of society, as I stated, I believe in the PowerPoint, having death totals in some areas as high as 90%, ultimately completely ends up devastating large segments of civilizations in the New World. And if you think about eventually what happens and the colonizing of North and South America by Europeans, that is really only made possible by the fact that so many of the indigenous populations of the Americas end up being killed by these diseases. If it was not for that, if there were much higher populations of American Indian groups still in North and South America, Europeans would have had a much more difficult time colonizing the Americas, and history probably would look quite a bit different. So, if you're thinking about how it impacted your life today, if you are from a group that has immigrated to the Americas, it's entirely possible that you would not be living here today if it were not for the impact that these diseases ended up having. Another impact that you see is an expansion of world trade to the new hemisphere and kind of a new center of trade in the Atlantic Ocean, which becomes very important to sustaining and ultimately to the prospering of the colonies that Europeans end up setting up in the Americas. For a long time, the Indian Ocean had kind of been the center of world trade, as trade between China, India, the Middle East, and Eastern Africa had really been the center of world trade for thousands of years up until this point in time. With the colonizing of the Americas, you see a new center of world trade in the Atlantic now springing up that becomes very lucrative for many people, but also having some very drastic drawbacks as well, particularly, and another one of these very large impacts of the exchange is the exchange of human beings and people, particularly in the form of the slave trade, taking enslaved individuals from Africa to the Caribbean, to North America, in some cases to South America, and that you see a large population shift occurring on the global level as well. And yeah, to one degree or another, it's really hard to envision the modern world today, particularly if you live in North or South America, as being anything the way it is today without the Columbian Exchange and the impacts, both positively and negatively, that occurred as a part of that exchange. Incredibly important in the way the world looks today. So, what ultimately ends up influencing the different ways that the early European colonies developed in the Americas? And to answer this question, I really look at kind of three main components that kind of distinguish and differentiated the different European areas from one another. The first one is who exactly the European colonists were. Where were they coming from? Were they coming from Great Britain? Were they coming from France? Were they coming from Spain? Also, which groups within those countries were moving? Were they part of Puritan religious minorities? Were they wealthy young prospectors? Were they kind of part of the aristocracy and nobility and kind of the lower lords? A lot of who the European colonists were ends up determining the kind of societies that develop in the Americas. And that leads to the second main point, and very much directly tied to the first one, and that is what were the goals of the European powers in their interactions with the Americas. Because if you look at these various groups, each of these groups have very different goals. For example, for the majority of Spanish territory, their main goal was the accumulation of material wealth, particularly in the form of gold and silver that they were able to take and steal from the Aztecs, the Incas, these very large American civilizations that had existed before the presence of Europeans, that the Europeans were able to come in, the Spanish in particular, take over these large civilizations and pretty much steal a lot of their material wealth. That ends up becoming kind of Spain's main goal, and a lot of the colonial aspects that they set up is really based around that aspect. of trying to draw a lot of the wealth out of these well-established empires back to Spain. If you're talking about the British, once more you have very different goals. And one of the early differentiations we see between the northern and the southern colonies is really based upon this as well. In the south, with the development of Jamestown, and we'll be talking about these differences, or we would have been talking about one of these differences last class period. I'm just giving you a brief rundown here. But in the south with Jamestown, you see a lot more kind of prospectors, people coming over wanting to strike it rich, young adventurers. And eventually, with the development of cash crops, you start seeing kind of these entrepreneurs who are buying up massive quantities of lands and eventually purchasing large number of enslaved individuals in order to grow and trade cash crops back to Europe. In the northern portions of the British colonies, you see the Pilgrims and the Puritans setting up kind of religious enclaves that are meant to be formed around kind of to create these religious utopias and to separate their religious groups from other religious groups and pressures from Europe. And that, so very different goals with the British colonies than with the Spanish colonies. The growing and trading of cash crops, the seeking religious isolation, and then with the French in kind of what is today Canada and also extending into the Great Lakes region and to the central portions of North America, the French were really much more interested in working with the established trading routes and networks of American Indians to get furs, get other trading goods and materials to bring back and trade in Europe for a different kind of material wealth. Not necessarily getting the gold and the silver themselves, but looking for valuable trade goods. And the third aspect then is how these European powers and colonists end up interacting with the American Indian groups that they encounter. When you're talking about the Spanish, of course, were interacting with which had been very large stratified agricultural societies of the Aztec and the Inca, and were really, in that case, able to set themselves up at the head of established large hierarchies and integrate themselves into those societies. There was much more cultural mixing that happened in these areas. Also, because there were many fewer Spanish women who came to these colonies, a lot of times you had Spanish men who were marrying into these kind of established aristocratic American Indian families within these empires and using that to kind of form their power base and their control, and a result of which meant that there is a much larger group of mixed race or mixed cultural individuals within the Spanish territory. And ultimately that ends up playing a large role in what those territories end up looking like. The fact that there is more American Indian elements within those governments and how there's kind of a more cultural mixing between the two groups. The goals, of course, the British were always based much more around the accumulation of land, whether it was large tracts of land for the development of, plantations to be growing these cash crops, or whether it was the accumulation of land for more towns, more villages, and that the British were much more interested in bringing over women, children, families, and having natural population increase within the colonies, which increasingly put them in opposition with existing American Indian groups who saw their land continuously being coming under assault from these British groups. Because the British were much more self-contained, they did not have the same cultural mixing that the Spanish did. They really begin seeing the American Indians as a much more kind of hostile force. They become much more hostile to American Indians, and that because they were at this point in time really competing over the same resources to a certain degree, you see a much more contentious relationship develop between the British colonies and American Indian groups than with the Spanish, or in the case of the French. As I said, the French, they were of course after kind of these natural resources in the form of kind of trade goods, and of course to that end they became much more willing to ingratiate themselves with the American Indian groups that they encountered, establish permanent and long-lasting trade relationships that in some cases were mutually beneficial, some cases not, but you had much less antagonism between the French. You had much fewer French citizens permanently moving into the Americas than in the case of the British. And many times the traders who would move into the British and were establishing these relationships with American Indian groups would marry into those groups to kind of help the economic process. A lot of times American Indians wanted to deal and found it very economically beneficial if you are dealing and doing business with a family member. The French, of course, took advantage of this, not just to have companionship in the New World, but also to develop these real strong economic bonds between the French and American Indian groups. So once more, you see a much different dynamic developing between the French and American Indians than the British and American Indians and the Spanish and American Indians, and to some degree, the various ways and the various goals of each of these European groups and how they were able to interact with the American Indian groups already present, and in a lot of cases, the owners of the land in the New World, and how those worked out ends up influencing how these various colonies developed. All right, moving on to PowerPoint question number 3. Moving forward, seeing how the British colonies eventually developed, they're able to push the French out, kind of take over the majority of what is today Canada. Through the 7 Years' War. 7 Years' War creates lots and lots of debt, which the British Empire then tries to recoup by taxing the colonists. And really, the group within the colonies that was most reluctant and most offended by this taxation and this example of kind of British power were sort of the elites, the people at the top, the people who were the business owners. These are the people that the taxes were impact the most. They were the ones who had the most to lose. Also, in a lot of ways, the sort of economic elite in the north, the Boston merchants and so forth, as well as the slave-owning elite in the southern colonies, had pretty much established a social order that put them firmly on the top. And they were very reluctant to give up any of that control or any of that power back to the British. And we're seeing the British take a heavier hand in the colonies as an indication that their position was under threat. And that is something then that they were willing to go out and eventually fight over. Of course, it wasn't only the elite who were behind the revolution. They were able to bring, a wide range of support onto their side from various segments within society. Even if it doesn't directly impact everyone, a lot of these taxes affected various colonists to various levels, and they were able to drum up a lot of support. And one of the most important things to remember about the revolutionary time period is that even though a lot of times the colonists who were fighting back against the British and pushing back against them were operating primarily out of their own self-interest, they were phrasing these ideas intellectually through the lens of a sort of intellectual flourishing in Europe known as the Enlightenment. And this is where you get ideas such as life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness in the form of the works of John Locke, a increased emphasis on religious tolerance and religious toleration, as well as kind of an entrepreneurial emphasis, a questioning of the kind of established mercantilist economic policies that had been prevalent through a lot of Europe, so that the voices and the frustrations of the colonists were voiced in these Enlightenment ideals, and kind of their case of why they were correct in rebelling against the British were founded in the voice of the Enlightenment, and that is what they articulated in documents such as the Declaration of Independence. You see Thomas Jefferson, for example, really channeling a lot of Enlightenment ideas and actually, to a certain degree, plagiarizing John Locke in the formation of what eventually becomes kind of the American creed, right? That all people are created equal and are endowed of certain unalienable rights, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Or at this time, was articulated as property. Um, but of course, it's very important to keep in mind, and this really gets to, I think, the heart of this question, that these ideas and ideals were being voiced in a very different way with a very different meaning at this point in time. Of course, many of the signers of the Declaration of Independence who were supporting this idea of natural rights, of equal rights, were themselves slave owners and slaveholders. And certainly they did not mean that all men were created equal. What they really meant was that it was all white Protestant men of wealth and property were created equal, and that they were perfectly fine still having disparities of wealth and power within society underneath them, as long as they were all seen as equal to each other. A very different view and a very different concept than what we articulate it as today. But that really doesn't undermine its importance. It's very important to keep that in mind, but ultimately, by phrasing the creation of the country in those terms and using that as its creed and those as its founding ideals, it kind of created a slippery slope that the founders of this country didn't necessarily intend. And that was that future generations could take those same words and take them much more literally than was intended and interpreted by the very first wave of American founding individuals. And that they would eventually broaden that meaning to mean not all just men, but all men and women of different races, of different cultures, of different sexuality. Of course, we are continuing to interpret these ideals and these meanings to this day, and to a certain degree, we are still debating exactly how they should be interpreted and implemented within our society. But none of that would have been possible without them first being articulated. And even if they were not meant to the fullest degree at the time of their inception, the fact that they were still used as the justification for the establishment of our country ends up being pretty important for the future generations that take those words and those meanings and expand upon them. But for the time, I think it's very important to see that the revolution, although being a victory for the rights of some people within the Americas, was certainly not across the board a victory for civil rights or human rights by any means, as you see that there are large segments of the population which were not best served or well served by the colonists winning the revolution over the British. Of course, the British lost out. They were the losers in this process to the degree that they had lost one of their largest colonies. But of course, they were able to rebound from this fairly quickly, and were ultimately much more tied down with events that had developed within Europe, such as the French Revolution, eventually the Napoleonic Wars. But what have much more long lingering effects, and some of which we are still going to be talking about and seeing in our class period, is the, from this point on, continual encroachment of colonial Americans and eventually Americans into American Indian lands, and the taking of those lands away from American Indians for the use of pretty much white Euro-Americans. In the same way that essentially after the time, between the time period of the Revolution and the Civil War, the institution of slavery ultimately becomes much more invigorated. This is partially due to the development of the Industrial Revolution and the great demand and impact that that had for raw materials produced in the Americas, that a lot large portions of the southern economy was set up to deliver, which really called for an increase in the importance and the number of enslaved individuals which they were going to have to be exploiting. So that you ultimately see an intensification of violence against American Indians, as well as the institution of slavery after the American Revolution, which in a lot of ways, of course, we can look at it today as going against those founding principles. As I stated already, did not many people who at this point in time did not see it that way. Um, but that is ultimately where a lot of the answers to question number 4 come up as kind of the divides that start happening within our country, because ultimately what ends up happening is that with the Declaration of Independence to the Constitution, you start seeing some inherent hypocrisies set up and created with the Bill of Rights and so forth when you are espousing equality and freedom to a certain part of the population, but not to other parts of the population. And that these are going to be aspects that are going to be very pivotal as as the country moves on, and that these hypocrisies are increasingly called into question by various groups. All right, moving on to question number 4. What do you think caused the North and South to develop in such different directions between the Revolutionary and Civil War? A lot of you did a really good job of answering this question. Of course, the one of the biggest aspects is economics, right? The fact that the North began to be much more industrialized, there was much more immigration from various parts of Europe into the North. In that sense, there was a little bit more cultural diversity occurring within the northern states as opposed to the southern states. The southern states, of course, really doubled down on the institution of slavery, as I said, in response to the Industrial Revolution, the fact that cotton in particular becomes very important. One of the first industries to be industrialized was the clothing industry, which pretty much created an insatiable demand for cotton. And the southern economy becomes pretty much directly developed to supply this demand. And ultimately, it becomes one of the most important economic aspects, not just of the southern economy, but of the American economy. I believe at one point in time, around 65 to 70% of all exports from the United States are in fact cotton. And the majority of those are going to Great Britain, one of the other first industrialized um, countries in the world. Even though we had fought the revolution with them, very quickly there are economic links that were strong before the revolution, continue after the revolution, with many caveats therein. But that eventually it comes out that the American South is supplying large portions of the cotton that the British textile industry is very much in need of, and is making a very large amount of money. But it's important to note that that is money for a relatively select few. The vast majority of the people, to a certain degree, both in the North and the South, who are benefiting from this are the people still who are at the top, right? You have the plantation owners. Of course, then there are slaves, and there's a large portion of pretty much underclass white individuals in the South as well. People who don't own slaves. There's small farmers. Small landowners, but it's very difficult for them to find economic success because there's generally few ways in the southern economy to get ahead outside of purchasing more land, purchasing more slaves, and fitting into the economy in that way. In the north, there are a few more avenues of progression with the creation of new industries, of different jobs that require essentially less labor or less skill to conduct, and just a changing economy in the north, which provided generally more opportunities for more people outside of just the kind of very singularly focused economy of the South. So a very very important distinction that economically they are very different. And ultimately, this leads to some very different social institutions in the North and the South. As I said, the South was very much built around maintaining this kind of racial social hierarchy, where you have pretty much the southern elites, the slave owners, the landowners on the very top. Then you have kind of this middling ground of free whites, but those who do not have the wealth or the power. Primarily, they are not included or incorporated in a lot of government positions. and that they are not generally incorporated into many aspects of kind of the elite social hierarchy either. And of course, under those, then you have a very large enslaved population. And that one of the main goals in the South had always been preventing the lower class white individuals from allying or making common cause with black enslaved individuals. And the most potent way to keep this enforced uh, pretty much was the creation and the sustaining of very strict um, racial identities between these various groups, and the formation and continuation of racism to try to pretty much convince the whites who did not have the money or the power that they were still better off than these black enslaved individuals, create conflict and hatred between those groups so that essentially the people who were at the top, who were benefiting off of the entire system, would really have no challenges to their power. And they were very successful in doing that for a long period of time. Within the North, you have a relatively different, there's still, of course, a lot of social stratification in the North as well. As I said, there's a few more opportunities, though, for growth. There's a much broader range of cultures moving in. There's more Germans, there's more Irish. There's, a more religious diversity within the northern states than in the southern states to a large degree. Um, and really, another big impact that develops during this time period is known as the Second Great Awakening, and it was kind of a reinvigoration of religion within the country. And ultimately, that causes a lot of people to start looking at kind of what we'd probably consider today social justice issues. Things such as women's rights, things such as looking at the institution of slavery and questioning it really for the first time in American history at least. Looking at the consumption of alcohol and trying to look at social ills and find a cause and root for that in alcohol in the creation of the temperance movement. And these kind of social justice movements were more prevalent in the North, and ultimately, particularly with the abolition movement or the movement to end slavery, the South starts seeing themselves as being vilified or demonized by these kind of northern social justice groups, and they are very put off by that. They think that kind of this racial hierarchy that they have established in their viewpoint, by the Southern elite's viewpoint, was correct, and that and essentially vital to their economic stability, and that any questioning of that from the North was met with a lot of hostility from the Southern elites, and that once more causes one of these divides. And of course, culturally, are some pretty wide divides between the North and the South as well. And all of these, of course, lead up to the fracturing of the country through the process of the Civil War, which I detailed in the PowerPoint, which you read. And a lot of people then brought that into PowerPoint question number 5. What do you believe were the most important aspects of how the United States developed by the beginning of our class time period of 1877? A lot of people said, the Civil War kind of moving past the issue of slavery. And of course, slavery as an institution here, not talking about moving past the idea of social inequity or anything like that. Of course, as you could see at the end of the last slide on Reconstruction, that is still a very prevalent part. This is the beginning in 1877 and at the end of Reconstruction and forward of the Jim Crow era, where pretty much those same wealthy white elites who had been the slave-owning aristocracy before the Civil War finds ways to regain most of their power after the Civil War. Even though slavery has come to an end, they still find ways to profit, and they still maintain and uphold these very rigid racial lines which they had drawn in the sand and try to continually perpetuate them. And one of the biggest things that we're going to see moving from 1877 forward is that, kind of ironically enough, one of the places that the Southern elites begin finding sympathy and common cause is actually in the North. As the North now for the first time is having an increase of more free blacks moving into the North, they're also having a large increase in immigration from other parts of Europe. and that it becomes very appealing not just to the white Southern elites or Northern elites to try to draw these real distinct, clear racial lines and use those to benefit and sustain their own wealth and their own power. And we're going to see that playing out in several different ways from this time period going forward. So it's important to note that even though slavery ends with the Civil War, racial injustice is only, I shouldn't say just beginning, but it's entering only a new phase. There's certainly um, a long way to go at this point in time, as you will see. Um, but what other things were important, and what are some of the things that I find to be the most important aspects? First of all, kind of going back to question number one, I would say the depopulation of the Americas and American Indian cultural groups due to the Columbian exchange diseases. And like I said, pretty much all of the colonization that was to follow from that point on, the development of the Spanish, the British, and the French colonies, and the lingering effects that those had today are all based upon the that initial 80 to 90 incredibly high casualty rates that these diseases and the social effects of them end up having in the New World. Also, I think the inclusion of Enlightenment ideals in the formation of America and the formation of the American Creed, the idea that all men or all humans are created equal and endowed with inalienable rights, the inclusion of a Bill of Rights into the Constitution, another aspect of this, that there's this idea that there are these human rights or these natural rights that everyone has, very important. As I said, even though it wasn't fully realized at the time of their creation, even though it certainly wasn't realized by the beginning of our class period, it set a goal out there, something that can be aspired to, and that various individuals and various people throughout these time periods we're going to be talking about have found new meanings in those words and in those ideals, have reinterpreted them and broadened them out to a wider and wider group. Certainly, as I just stated, that doesn't mean that it put an end to racial injustice or social injustice or economic injustice. That, of course, was all still there, and to a certain degree is certainly still with us to this day. But the fact is, like I said, it gave us a goal and an idea of what America could be. And I think that is something that we're all still working towards to a certain degree to this day. And at least for me, I'm perfectly fine with that. I mean, I think some people are very hesitant or reluctant and want to go back and kind of retroactively look at history and say, look, we have this great ideal. We've always lived up to it. You can't question how great America has always been. Unfortunately, that doesn't really match with the history and the attitudes and the thoughts and beliefs of the people who created that history. I'm perfectly willing to say that America has not reached up to this ideal at this point in time. But that gives me a lot of encouragement because it's something that we are still striving towards. It's something that we can still achieve. It's a goal that we can still strive towards. And I think that that's something that's been important to every generation of Americans, as you'll see as we go throughout the class. The Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening and the creation of these social justice movements really kind of the ability to look at our society and kind of make those judgments and say, hey, maybe we're not where we should be. Maybe there's something and somewhere greater that we can go to. I think those were very important in how America developed up until this point in time, because after 1877, the issue of slavery or the institution of slavery had been destroyed, but of course women had not achieved the right to vote yet. So one of the first big social justice pushes that we see going into the progressive era, which we'll be talking about in a few weeks, is of course trying to expand the right of women to vote. Industrialization, another vitally important part, another aspect that a lot of you pointed out very correctly, very important to how the United States looks at the beginning of our time period. Because shortly after the beginning of our time period, really the 1870s up to 1900 is kind of a reinvigoration of this industrialization process and how that really becomes tied to the American identity. Before the Civil War, there had been very strong components of it, but of course, because America had been so economically divided, it was much more of kind of a northern quality, a northern definer, not necessarily a national definer, moving after the Civil War from 1877 or 1870s forward, it really becomes linked with the American identity, and ultimately the way kind of economically, socially, culturally that America develops very much tied into its degree of industrialization, including the need for increased labor, which ultimately leads to another kind of immigration boom in the country, which once more adds in many more layers of cultural diversity into our country and into America. And once more, we'll be talking more about that in a few weeks here. Um, and finally, really, the unification after the Civil War and kind of a reinvigoration that you see between the 1870s and 1900 of nationalism. How pretty much the political and social elites of the North and the South are able to come back together, find common causes and kind of a nationalistic identity in order to politically push the country to a different place. Whether it is kind of completing this idea of manifest destiny of taking over the rest of the continental United States. Pretty much, we'll be talking about this next week, finding ways to take American Indian groups and force them onto smaller and smaller portions of land to open up the rest of the land for pretty much white Euro-American settlement, development, and use. That's one of the main kind of unifiers moving forward, as well as eventually looking at America's place in the world. Up until this point in time, America had really been very isolationist. It had been much more concerned with pretty much establishing control over all the continental United States. The division between the North and the South ultimately ends up, before the Civil War era, of course, being a real divisive factor. After the Civil War period, you start, and moving into the 1900s, you start seeing America begin to reinterpret its role and its place in the world and in international politics in a way that it really had not prior to this point in time. And we'll be talking more about that moving into the semester as well. So I think those are kind of the key points from where America and the United States had been up to where we are now in 1877. I know this is a pretty long, pretty thorough video. Most of them are probably going to be a little bit shorter than this. But because I'm trying to kind of recapture and rehash a lot of what would have been covered in the first section of this course, just to kind of bring everyone up to speed, I want to make it as thorough as I could. If you have any questions on the PowerPoint questions, on your answers, on the points you received, or anything like that, please feel free to contact me or let me know. Or if you have any other questions about the information covered in this PowerPoint, in this review, or the book, the PowerPoints, or the videos throughout the semester, please contact me at any point in time and let me know. And I hope you all have a great week moving into the second week of class here. All right, thank you all very much, and good luck.